Hi, and thank you for joining me for today's live reading of Wicked Treasure, The Charm Collector, Book 2 by Melissa Erin Jackson, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1, Kata. Kata fastened her belt as she walked out of her bedroom, only to stop dead in her tracks in her doorway. Her gaze snapped to the left. A series of soft clicks sounded from her balcony. Body tense and eyes narrowed, she dropped her hands from her waist and curled her fingers into fists by her sides. She was sleep-deprived and punchy. Whatever in the hells was on her balcony had chosen the wrong day to mess with her. She had to get to work for her extra shift at the casino. She'd been working a lot of extra shifts lately. Working meant she had somewhere productive to aim her frustration and concern about Harlow, specifically at the drunken idiots wandering the casino floor. With any luck, she'd be able to bodily throw another teenager orc out the door by his tail. An underage orc kid had been trying to go unnoticed last night. He was young enough that his tusks hadn't started to protrude over his upper lip yet, and his skin was a milky lime instead of a vibrant green, but his tail had given him away. Unlike human men who could get self-conscious about certain appendages being too short, for orc men, the shorter your tail, the older and more virile you were. Insecure young orc males like the oaf yesterday tucked or docked their tails to appear older. The tail on this one had busted out the back of his pants and had whipped a martini right out of a lady's hand. There weren't many orcs in Luma, mostly because once they were of age, if they hadn't gotten into a sport or profession that let them expel their genetically enhanced rage, they often wound up involved in enough criminal shenanigans that they were imprisoned or exiled before they were out of their 20s. Kata had delighted in tossing the Orc Kid out, but the delight had been a temporary balm to her lingering worry. The clicking sounded again. It was faint, almost drowned out by the sea of voices outside thanks to rush hour traffic from the telepad station down the street. Streams of people were leaving work while others flooded into the area for the shops and the restaurants. Sometimes Kata cursed her heightened Draken hearing. It took time, patience, and training to learn how to filter ambient noise. A lady could go mad if she heard everything from a rumbling airplane overhead to a munching earthworm below all at once. Kata's sense of hearing was like adjusting the dials on a radio, instinctually turning up certain noises while dialing back others. When she was in an emotionally heightened state, however, as she had been for weeks, the dials were more like malfunctioning faucets that turned on full blast at inopportune times, causing confusion and debilitating headaches. The fact that she could hear the soft sound outside told her she was, at least currently, in a steady frame of mind. Squaring her shoulders, she stalked across her small living room, past the dining room table marred with angry scratches from Harlow's demented sword, and to the closed windows that overlooked the tiny balcony. The blinds were drawn shut. Clink, clink. If this damn apartment building had another pixie infestation, so help her. She reached up, grabbed hold of the drawstring on the blinds, and yanked the cord down in one fluid motion. Perhaps the quick movement would scare the winged monsters and give them simultaneous heart attacks. Kata liked the idea of her balcony being littered with tiny petal garments like potpourri. What stood on the railing of her porch was neither startled nor a pixie. It was a bluebird the size of a house cat. Kata cocked her head. The unruffled bird mirrored the action. When Kata did nothing more than stare at it for 10 long seconds, the bird walked a couple of inches to the right along the railing and then to the left, never taking its eyes off Kata. Avian pacing. Click, 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 went the bird's talons. Kata unlatched the window and forced it up. A few white flakes of white paint fluttered onto the worn wood of the windowsill. As Kata stooped under the open window, the shattered glass, also thanks to Harlow's sword, had been replaced, at least. The bird did an about face on the railing and tottered back the other way. The balcony gave a soft groan of protest under Kata's weight, but held firm. Sunlight winked off a copper cap atop the black plastic tube affixed to the bird's leg. This was a courier bird. Who in the hells would send Kata a courier bird? The bluebird stopped directly in front of Kata and held out its leg, clearly wanting to speed up this process. Kata reached for it tentatively, not because she feared the bird, but because she wasn't the best at handling small, delicate things with care. Her pinky was bigger than the tube. She'd much rather snap the bird's leg off so she could take her time getting the tube open, but she figured the bird would take offense to that. She fiddled with the top of the small canister, accidentally poking the bird's chest. For her efforts, she got a sharp beak jabbed into the back of her hand. Ow! Squawk! Growling, Kata grabbed the bird with both hands and tucked it under her arm like a football, feet up. The bird offered a muted squawk from somewhere near her armpit. After some finagling, Kata found the button to push on top of the plastic tube, which caused the bottom to pop open. A small scroll of paper was curled inside. She had no easy way to get it out, though, as her fingers were too wide. She turned the bird over and gave it a hard shake to dislodge the scroll. The bluebird shrieked and pecked its thick beak into Kata's wrist. Yelping, she managed to release the bird and catch the message. The bird dive-bombed Kata's head a few times, narrowly missing swipes from Kata's large hands, then squawked very loudly directly into Kata's face. I don't like you much either, Kata shouted, though she supposed it wasn't the bird's fault Kata wasn't blessed with fine motor skills. The bird sailed over the top of the apartment building across the street and out of sight, presumably heading back to its rookery. Kata stared down at the scroll in her hand and cursed softly to herself, doing her best to unfurl it without tearing the thin paper. Unlike the telepost message Kata had received a week or so ago that had supposedly been from Harlow, yet written by someone else, this note was in Harlow's familiar scrawl. I wish we could eat ramen until we burst. I hate that I haven't been able to call you. I promise I'm safe, but I've been scared to draw too much attention to you. I'm leaving the city, but not forever. Stabby, Mr. Supervillain, yes really, and I are going on an adventure. Grayson will be jealous. I miss you. Kata reread the message 5 times before her brain let her accept what it said. Harlow had left Luma. Not only had she left, but she'd done so with the sword and Mr. Supervillain? As in Caspian Blackthorn? There had been rumors spreading all over the city about what Harlow was actually up to, where she'd gotten the sword, and if she and Caspian Blackthorn were in cahoots. That last one had been the hardest for Kata to believe. How could Harlow have been with Caspian? Up until a month or so ago, they hadn't known each other. Hells, Harlow hadn't even known what the guy looked like. Swapping theories on Caspian's identity had been one of Kata and Harlow's pastimes. And why would Grayson be jealous? The water elemental was only obsessed with one thing, pirates. Kata supposed adding pirates into the mix wasn't out of the range of possibility at this point. There was so much Harlow hadn't told Kata, and now she was gone. Kata squeezed her hand into a fist, crumpling the note. How dare Harlow keep Kata in the dark just to protect her? That was the same bullshit Felix had pulled on Harlow. Kata was sure of it, and now Harlow was doing it to her. Kata wanted Harlow back in Luma so Kata could strangle her. She heaved a sigh. Only Harlow and Henry could get her this riled up, and for 2 completely different reasons. Being pissed off wasn't productive, and she still had to get to work. Climbing back through her window, she tossed the crumbled note onto her kitchen counter. Her attention, as it often did, shifted to the shiny tower of black plastic by her TV. She'd had the newest iteration of this gaming console for a few weeks, a gift to herself to help her deal with the stress of not knowing what was going on with Harlow. She'd much rather resume her game from last night to smash buttons and the heads of monsters alike, but she had to finish getting ready for work. On her way toward the door, she shot a furtive glance at the tiny ball of paper on her counter. It was currently her sole connection to Harlow. The paranoid lady refused to use a cell phone other than in dire emergencies, and she still hadn't called Kata during the mess of the last month. If getting accused of murder and being on the lam with a psychotic sword didn't equal an emergency, Kata didn't know what would. Kata crossed the living room to her kitchen and tentatively picked up the note, smoothing out the paper. Her gentle efforts resulted in a corner being ripped off. She grabbed a can of coffee and clunked it on top of the paper. That would straighten it out. Later, she'd figure out what to do with the information given to her. Kata had just finished putting her belongings in her locker at the start of her shift when she heard a commotion from the connected break room. She glanced at the clock on the wall above the door. She had 5 minutes before she had to be on the casino floor. The break room didn't get much use. Most of the staff preferred to eat outside in the casino's outdoor pavilion area to get away from the constant noise and permeating smoke of the place, both of which traveled under the employee-only doors. Hardly anyone used the room with any frequency other than Julianne, who was obsessed with Fate of the Heart, a trashy soap opera that had a bunch of will they, won't they romantic subplots between humans and fae. The answer was always yes, of course they will. The true question was, will it end in tragedy? The answer was usually yes there too. Boris was often in there with Julianne, claiming he was also a fan of the show, but everyone knew that what Boris was a fan of was Julianne. The irony? Boris was a Draken and Julianne a human. Boris had it even worse for Julianne than Kata had it for Henry. When Kata poked her head into the small room though, Fate of the Heart wasn't on the TV mounted in the corner. A newscast was. Boris and Julianne were in the room, but so were 5 others. Henry wasn't, which Kata was simultaneously glad about and disappointed by. She was actively avoiding him, after all. "What's going on?" she asked. The chatter from those assembled was even louder than the TV. A few of them turned to glance at her. Boris said, "The collective is going to have a press conference." Well, I mean, they're going to play their pre-recorded press conference soon. He rolled his eyes, then faced the screen again with the familiar chime sounded, alerting viewers that a sorcerer or one of their spokescats had something important to say. The collective had been working very hard to paint themselves in a better light, holding press conferences on a nearly daily basis since Harlow and her new friends had hijacked the news. Kata wasn't sure how effective these face-saving measures were. She figured most people tuned in because they secretly craved it would happen again. That someone would break into the curated newscast with the other anti-collective message. It had happened just the one time, though. Instead of that newscast from weeks ago being about the collective's diligent work to get the missing Fae girls back home, the Fae girls themselves had appeared on screen, telling all of Luma what had really happened to them. They'd been drugged with bliss, trafficked out of Luma, and while in a drug-filled haze, had been working with a vampire who used the beautiful Fae to lure his human food out of clubs and into his nest of waiting vampires. A goblin girl, Vian, had died while in captivity, which the collective had tried to hide. 8 girls had been found alive, 5 of whom had been from Luma. The others had been trafficked out of hubs in the Pacific Northwest and were presumably home now. At the end of the account from the Fae girls and a couple of their parents, the screen had gone black. White letters had spelled out the question: whose side is the collective on? What aren't they telling us? The girls hadn't outright accused the collective of being aware of what was happening and ignoring it, but the implication had been undeniable. There had been protests in the streets almost immediately. People praised Harlow and her sword for bringing the girls home. Yet, the prevailing opinion seemed to be that Harlow had murdered those shifters. The majority of people who had been polled in the days since, if the polls could even be trusted, thought Harlow was a hero. But they also believed she needed to pay for her crimes. Kata didn't blame her for skipping town. She took offense to learning about it in a goddess-damn note. One of the grim-faced sorcerers was on screen now, with the usual Sorcerers Collective logo, silhouettes of several hands all reaching upward toward a ball of glowing light, painted in gold on the black wall behind him. The logo was supposed to symbolize the power of many working to create a unifying force. Kata had always more or less accepted the collective for what it was, an almost faceless organization that kept Luma enclosed in its little sanctuary where in-the-know humans, magic, and the descendants of non-Earth natives could exist peacefully. The goings-on of the collective rarely affected her daily life that much, so they didn't take up much space in her mind. What had happened with Harlow, though, made Kata wonder if she'd been naive all this time, thinking Harlow was too paranoid for her own good. "Hello, citizens of Luma," the sorcerer intoned dryly. "We know there have been many reports out of Montclair about mundanes and fae, goblins in particular, rioting and causing property damage. While this isn't a new event as of late, in light of what transpired recently, what is new is that the mundanes have been armed with charmed items too. We too have the dynamic images of Harlow Fletcher burned into our minds, the dragon sword in her hand. This image might be emboldening to other mundanes who idolize her, but remember that she is not completely innocent." Kata's eyes narrowed. 2 of her coworkers looked over, knowing Harlow was Kata's best friend. Boris smiled at her sympathetically. Davis, however, lacked sympathy and tact. "Hey, Kay, psst." She cut him a glare. Davis was unfazed, probably because he had a good 6 inches and 100 pounds on her, and also because he was dumber than a sack of rocks. "You got any idea where your girl is? Think she'll kill again?" "Shut up, Davis," she snapped. "Jeez," he said, hands up. "What'd I say?" Rolling her eyes, she refocused her fury on the TV. Any charmed item imbued with more than level 4 magic is quite detrimental to a mundane's well-being, the sorcerer droned. Anyone caught selling such items to mundanes will be apprehended by the werecats or bounty hunters and brought before the collective for judgment. These items are banned for a reason. Reporting information about mundanes using these banned goods that leads to an arrest will earn the Good Samaritan $2,000. To those naysayers who believe these reckless mundanes will learn their lesson when they use magic beyond their means, may we remind you that regardless of their lack of magic, it was humans who were able to slay the few ancient beasts who wound up on Earth due to the glitch. History books, as young as they were, written by the first generation of marooned Fae, tell grand stories of dragons, griffins, and chimeras from the Fae homeworld. They spoke of how these great beasts ruled the land and skies. Though they were mighty, they were few on Earth, and those few were slain by humans who used the ancients' own magic against them. Davis grumbled something under his breath. Those dark times are behind us now. We have reached a unity among Fae and mundanes, the sorcerer said, awkwardly gesturing to the logo behind him as his disingenuous smile twitched. Powerful, emotion-provoking orators sorcerers were not. Instead of Fae fearing what mundanes could do to us, we have built a society where we can live together as one people, magic touched or not, because we care deeply about the well-being of our mundane neighbors. It's up to all of you to help us keep everyone out of harm's way. We understand that emotions are running high, and we understand your frustrations. We hear them, we are listening. We will do better together. The screen abruptly went black and white text scrolled across it with a phone number to use to call in reports about humans wielding charmed weapons, as well as a large reminder of the amount of the cash reward. The flashing red $2,000 made it feel like an infomercial. Kata honestly couldn't tell if the collective meant to protect humans and had expressed it in a very backhanded way, or if they were truly trying to incite violence against humans. Depending on who you talk to, mundanes was a slur. The fact that the collective used it might have been their precise way of speaking, or it could have been a way to stir up more unrest. He didn't know about what was whispered among the other Fae, but Kata knew there was a subset of Draken who resented humans because of the history on Earth. In school, everyone learned about how the humans had managed to kill off the larger Fae, armed with charmed weapons and their unflinching, egotistical fervor to hunt the foreign beasts into extinction. Dragons had a choice back then: shift into their human form to hide among the bloodthirsty population of humans who vastly outnumbered them, or remain in dragon form and destroy the humans who might hold the key to getting them back home. Most chose to shift, to blend into the population until things grew steadier. The longer the shifted dragons stayed in human form, the more they lost their ability to shift at all, though they retained their heightened senses, speed, and strength. Shifted dragons mating with others of their kind, and some mating with humans, created offspring that gave rise to the Draken. Heightened abilities were passed on, but the ability to shift was not. More and more Draken were born with weaker abilities every generation. Some in the community shunned anyone who diluted their powers by being with a human, which was part of the reason why, Kata guessed, Boris hadn't made the move on Julianne yet. If he had a family that was against it, he might pine away forever. So, Kay, Davis said, smiling broadly, where'd Harlow get that sword anyway? He was trying to sound casual, but he was clearly fishing for information. She have like a stash or something? Think she might be loaning some of that stuff out to people? Clearly the buffoon had no idea that Harlow Fletcher and Fletch, the semi-infamous charm collector, were one and the same. She rounded on him. You want me to rat out my best friend and anyone she might know to you? Davis's expression lit up. He looked right and left, finding a couple of their coworkers eyeing them. He took a step closer and lowered his voice. Conspiratorially, he said, We're totes on the same page, Kay. We could split the cash. You down? She stalked out of the room.